Have you ever felt that you were drifting and not really getting anywhere? I imagine that this was how the sailors felt after 2 weeks not knowing where they were going on the Adriatic Sea. Now, I want to warn some of you who look up on your cell phones where the Adriatic Sea is. The name Adriatic Sea has changed its location. Just like we talk about Asia now as being China and Japan, and Asia back then was around Turkey, the name Adriatic Sea has changed its location. It means the sea that was around the island of Malta, okay? That's what the Bible means when it says Adriatic Sea. So anyways, they were drifting. Can you imagine? Not really knowing where they were going or how they were going to get there. They were drifting for 2 weeks. Can you imagine feeling seasick? And at such times, we tend to lose our sense of purpose. But I want to assure you that God did not lose his sense of purpose for this voyage. He had everything worked out. And I want to invite you to turn with me to Acts chapter 27, starting with verse 27. Acts 27, starting with verse 27. When the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight, the sailors thought they were approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed a little farther, they sounded again, and they found it to be 90 feet deep. Then, fearing we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head." After he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat. They all were encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that had held the rudders. They hoisted the foresail into the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. Once safely ashore, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in, since it was raining and cold. As Paul gathered a bundle of brushwood and put it on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the local people saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man, no doubt, is a murderer. Even though he has escaped the sea, justice will not allow him to live." But he shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm. He expected that he would begin to swell up, they expected that he would begin to swell up or suddenly drop dead. After they waited a long time and saw nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now in the area around that place was an estate belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius's father was in bed suffering from a fever and dysentery. Paul went to him, and praying and laying hands on him, he healed him. After this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. May God bless this reading of his holy word. This passage I'm going to deal with in two sections. The first section is chapter 27, verses 27 to 44. And I want to talk to you about the 3 time periods that Luke emphasizes as he writes this story. The first time period is about midnight. That's what he calls it, about midnight, verses 27 to 32. And the sailors were preparing to come to land. So what did they do? They thought they were approaching land because of the sounds around them. They heard the water beating off a shore, and they said, "Oh, it sounds like we're getting close to land." So the sailors took 2 soundings. And you say, "Pastor, what is a sounding?" And if you're not familiar with sailing and shipping back in those days, you wouldn't know. So let me explain it to you. They had these long ropes, very, very long ropes, over 200 feet long. And they would tie the ropes in knots every 6 feet. And at the end of the rope, they would put a weight, maybe a stone or a piece of metal, and they would dip that rope into the ocean, holding on to the other end, and they counted every 6 feet as it went down. So they knew when they counted fathoms every 6 feet, they knew exactly how many fathoms were going, the rope was going into the sea, and they knew that the shore or the ground was about 20 feet deep. And then they pulled up the rope. This is work intensive, folks. They pull up the rope and they sail a little further, and then they do it again. But this time, as they're counting, they count that it's only 90 feet deep. So these are accurate countings of how deep it was. And if it goes from 120 feet to 90 feet deep, they realize they're getting close to shore. And what was the danger of getting close to shore? Very often, if there was an island, there were rocks around the shore. And if the ship would hit those rocks going at a speed because of the wind and the sails, if the ship would hit those rocks, it could mean disaster. So all of this was carefully planned, and they feared that they were going to run aground on the rocks. By the way, could we turn this series of lights on? I need them, please. Thank you. So they thought they were going to hit the rocks, and they dropped 4 anchors, so that there were 4 anchors on the ship, and they dropped them to slow down the boat so that the anchors would drag along. If it got low enough, the boat would slow down and they wouldn't hit the rocks as hard. So they dropped down 4 anchors and they prayed for daylight. All of these actions that they were doing, remember, were at midnight. They couldn't see what they were doing. They just did it with night eyes. You know how you drive at night? It's a different experience than driving during the day. So while all of this is happening, they're very busy trying to make a safe landing. Some of the sailors wanted to escape. They weren't too sure if they were going to be able to stop this ship from having a wreck. So they thought the way to get away from having a wreck is to take the skip or the lifeboat and take off. So the sailors were going to do that. And Paul finds out. I don't know how he found out. Maybe he listened to some of the sailors while they were talking. But Paul finds out what they were doing. In fact, they were pretending that they were going to put out anchors, but really they were going to try to escape. And Paul said, wait a minute, the Lord has made a promise to me that no one on the ship is going to die, but that promise was a conditional promise on the fact that everyone would stay with the ship. And if these sailors were leaving the ship, then the Lord was not bound to his promise. So Paul goes to the centurion, the leader, the boss man, and he says, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. You cannot rely on God's promise if you don't all stay with the ship. I haven't done it personally, but other preachers have said that this can be applied to church membership. They said, you need to stay with the ship. We need to stay together. So Paul says, you have to stay with the ship, and the centurion says, okay, we're going to do that. And how did he do it? He had the soldiers. Remember, there are 2 groups of people on board. There's the soldiers and the sailors. There's another group, actually. There's the prisoners. And the soldiers cut the rope holding the skiff, and they let the skiff drop away so nobody can escape. So that's about midnight. All that is happening about midnight. Then we find another time period, and that is about daylight, verse 33 to 38. Now, what we find out in verses 33 to 38 is that Paul knows that most of the people who have been on the ship drifting for 14 days have been either fasting or seasick. They have not been eating for 14 days. When I was in high school, there was something going around for missions called a 40-hour fast. And I took a 40-hour fast. Woo! At the end of 40 hours, I was really hungry. I could have orange juice in the morning, but nothing else. And after 40 hours, I was really hungry. Can you imagine 14 days without food? And these people had gone 14 days without food, and Paul realizes that if the skiff or the lifeboat has been cut off, they're not going to be able to use the lifeboat for anybody. So you know what that means? That means everybody's going to have to swim, or if they can't swim, they're going to have to hang on to the wreckage of the boat to get to the island. So if everybody's going to have to swim or hang on to the wreckage of the boat to get to the island safely, they're going to have eaten something to be strong enough to do this exercise. So Paul says, you've been waiting so long without food, you guys better eat something. And there's enough food on the boat, so he says, I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, so you're strong enough to get to land. He says, since none of you will lose a hair from your head. How did Paul know that? Because that's what God had told him. And he believed it. So then he said these things. He did an example. He was trying to be a good example for all the people he was talking to. And remember, it's actually stated in the text, Paul's talking not to 10 people, he's talking to 276 people. And he's saying, this is what we're going to do. And he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence, notice what it says, of all of them, all 276 people. And after that, he broke it and began to eat it. Does this text sound familiar to anybody? To me, it reminds me of the Lord's Supper. Paul took some bread. Jesus took bread. Paul took some bread. He gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after that, he broke it and began to eat. Paul is worshiping God in front of all these people as an example of how they are supposed to eat their food. And he began to eat. And as he began to eat, the strength comes into him, and it says that all the people were encouraged, and all the people took food, verse 36 and 37, and there were 276 people on the ship, as I've mentioned before. And then they began to throw the grain overboard. Why did they do that after everybody ate? To make sure everybody had enough to eat. Okay? But there is grain in the bottom of the ship, and this grain is very heavy. Most scholars think it was wheat, because wheat is heavier than other grains. There was grain on the bottom of the ship, and if they got that grain out of the ship, what would happen? the ship would lighten up. And that was the purpose of getting all this grain off. They forgot about the luxury of selling the grain. They just wanted to be safe, okay? So they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard. And this is all at about daylight time. Then it says, verse 39 to 44, when daylight came. You know the difference between dusk and dawn? The difference when it's kind of, you know daylight's coming, but it's still really dark, and then all of a sudden, it's daylight. Well, this is the description of those two times. The sailors planned to run the ship ashore. Now again we have this theme that goes all the way through this story, our plans and what really happens. The sailors planned that they were going to get the ship to run ashore and that everybody, we would just have a nice landing. But folks, how many of us know that a smooth landing doesn't always take place? And that's what happens here. They cut loose the anchors. They loosened the ropes that held the rudders. They hoisted for the sail and headed for the beach. And then it says this little word, but. They struck a sandbar, and they ran the ship aground, and the bow jammed fast, and the stern began to break up. We're hearing reading the ancient description of a shipwreck. Have you ever heard somebody talk about an accident they had with their car? And they said it was really a miracle because the car was totaled, but we were okay. This is the equivalent of that. The ship was totaled. They couldn't ever use it again. It was being broken to pieces by the waves. But the 276 people were able to either use the rubble to get to the shore, or they were able to swim to shore. And what God had promised Paul was that I have not only given you, I will not only protect you, but I have given you all the people with you. God's promise came true. And all the people were able to make it to land safely. But I want you to notice there was another thing that happened. Verses 42 to 43. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners. Now you have to understand the soldiers' perspective. The soldiers were told, their life for yours. In other words, if we don't get all of our prisoners safe and accounted for, you're dead. So the soldiers thought, well, as soon as we let people jump ship, they're going to try to escape. And if they escape, they're going to kill me. So we might as well kill all, have the prisoners be dead corpses and report them to the headquarters rather than have them escape. So they thought, we're going to kill all of these prisoners. The problem? Number one, Paul had promised that all of them would make it to shore safely. Number two, Paul was a prisoner. Paul would have been killed. And again, we have that little word, but, that changes the whole scenario. But the centurion kept them. Who's them? All of the prisoners. The centurion kept them from, all of the soldiers is what it means, from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And because of the centurion wanting to save Paul, God's word was fulfilled and all the prisoners made it safely onto Malta. Isn't that amazing? So he orders them to jump or swim or hang on to the... And verse 43b to 44 tells us that everyone reached the shore safely. Those who could swim went first, and the others clung to the wreckage. And the Lord's word that God gave to Paul in Acts 27, verses 23 to 26, that word was directly fulfilled. It came true. Now we get the report of what happened on the island of Malta. Paul met the local people there, verses 1 to 6 of chapter 28. And the local people were extraordinarily friendly. They were kind. They lit a fire, they took us in, and it was raining and cold, so we was very grateful that they did that. And Paul was helping the local people. They had lit a fire, and he gathers brushwood to put on the fire. And as he's gathering brushwood, he's not aware that there's a viper inside the brushwood that he's carrying. And he puts it on the fire, and from the brushwood jumps out a viper and attacks him right there. Now, the first assumption, by the way, do you know that old statement, assumption can make a blank out of you and me? Okay. If you don't know it, I'll tell you later. But assumptions are dangerous, right? And the assumption was, well, if this snake jumps out of the firewood and attacks Paul, that means that Paul must have been a bad guy. This man is a murderer. Was Paul a murderer? In fact, yes, he was. He had agreed to the stoning of Stephen. This man must be a murderer. Even though he has escaped the sea, justice will not allow him to live. But God wanted to make a point. And the point of this text was that God wanted to use his apostle to work miracles on the island of Malta. That was the point God wanted to make. So what happens? Paul shakes off the snake. Have you ever tried to shake off a snake? That don't happen so easy. He shook off the snake into the fire and suffered no harm. This, my friends, is a miracle of God. And then the people, first of all, they assumed that he would die. Now they're expecting him to die or swell up at least. And they waited a long time and nothing happened. So you know what? They changed their minds. This man must be a god. And some of us wonder, well, why didn't Luke explain that these guys aren't gods? And I want to suggest to you, he had already done that. If you go back to Acts chapter 14, Paul already explained that he was not a god. And Luke is trusting us to already know about that. So Luke goes on with his story. And he meets this local leader, Publius. And this man is a big landowner on the island. And he has this beautiful estate. And he welcomes these 276 travelers. And he entertains them for 3 days. You know what entertains means? He fed them. He allowed them to do various activities on his estate. He was extra specially kind to these people, treated them with wonderful hospitality. But I want you to notice that they didn't just stay on the island for 3 days. They were on the island for 3 months. Why? Because that was the winter. They had been trying to escape the winter and just go to Phoenix. Now they end up on Malta, and they stay there for 3 months. They wintered over there. Well, this guy Publius had a father who was suffering from fever and dysentery. And Paul asked God to heal Publius's father, and God heals him. And as a result of this man's father's healing, all of a sudden people from all over the island come with their sicknesses and their diseases, and Paul prays for them, and Paul heals them. And guess what? God used this shipwreck to start a Christian church on Malta. And my brother over here, Dominic, looked online and he found out that there are hundreds of churches, Christian churches on Malta to this day. And it all dates back to this shipwreck where the Apostle Paul was used by God to introduce Christianity to the island of Malta. Did God have a purpose for what was happening? Was the ship just drifting for nothing? No, God had a purpose. And if God brings you into a storm, he has a purpose for that storm, and he will bring you out of the storm at his time, in his way, for his purpose. You're not just drifting through life. God has a purpose for everything you experience. Even if it's difficult, even if it makes you cry, God still has a purpose for what he brings into your life. And when he gives you a promise that everyone will make it safe, he keeps the promise. So everyone arrives safely on Malta. They're there for 3 months to go through the winter. And when they set sail, guess what? The people of Malta were so kind that they set sail on a new ship, but they had no belongings. All their belongings perished with the ship. But the people of Malta provided them with everything they needed. God used the people of Malta to supply these 276 people with what they needed. Isn't God good? If God did that for Paul and these 276 people, could God do that for you too? Of course he could. And of course he will. If only you trust him. If you want to jump ship, it won't count. If you want to do it your own way, it won't count. But if you're willing to trust him and obey him and follow him, he's got your back. But you got to make that commitment. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I invite you to ask God to forgive your sins and come into your life and be your Lord and be a Christian from now on. If you're here and you've never publicly declared your faith, excuse me, publicly declared your faith through baptism, you could do that. I'd love to tell you how. And if you've been saved and baptized, but you haven't become a member of this local church, you could take that step today as well. So whatever God is placing on your heart to do in response to this message, I invite you to respond while we sing.